So it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Julian Huppert. Julian, tell me when and where you were born.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Alan. I was born in the US, somewhat surprisingly. I was only there for a couple of months, but in the Kaiser Hospital on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. So I'm told it was the poor end of town. But obviously I don't really remember that. My parents were on sabbatical in California at the time.
Right, and when?
1978, so 21st of July.
21st of July, you're just a youngster, yeah. So people are often influenced by their family, going back one or two generations, and occasionally Sir John Gurdon said he wanted to go back to the Norman Conquest, but would you like to tell me something about one or two back to your grandparents at least, and whether you knew them and how they influenced you?
Yeah, so I think my family were massively influential in everything I do, scientifically and politically. I didn't ever know my father's parents. They died when he was not that old. Yeah. His father when he was very young. And so I didn't know them particularly. I mean, Dad was, of course, a huge influence, but we'll come back to that later. My mother's parents I did know. My grandmother died on the day I came to Cambridge, so remember that very vividly. And I was influenced by them, and partly from their backgrounds. So if you go back further generations, they were foresters in Poland. I mean, actually now foresters now in what's now Ukraine, but it was Poland then. In the Second World War, as Polish
foresters, you mean they cut down trees?
They cut down trees. I mean, I think on a largish scale. I mean, the story is that they supplied quite a lot of sleepers to the Tsarist railways and never got paid. I think they were trying to be paid in 1917, and obviously things changed. But in the Second World War, being Polish Jewish landowners was not a great position when Poland was invaded. They fled, say, to the forest area, which is now Ukraine. And the part of the family that were on the German side were all killed. The part that were on the Russian side, which included my grandparents, were shipped out to slave labour camps in the Ural Mountains and worked as foresters there. I remember when I was young being told they didn't have to cut trees if it was below -40. And that, which is, as it happens, is the same temperature in centigrade and Fahrenheit. So I always remembered that number very, very well. But they were then released in 42, I think. 42, 43, whenever it was that Stalin released the Poles, and they went down to Uzbekistan as in a refugee camp. My mother was actually born in Samarkand in essentially a refugee camp, and they were then looking for asylum after the war finished. Poland was even more anti-Semitic than it had been, so they spent time briefly there, then in Paris applying for asylum. They were refused asylum here in the UK, and eventually made it to Australia. So Mum got to Australia in end of 48. And so that was influential. They were amazing, thoughtful, interesting, educated people, but also because I think it gave me an insight into how the world could be. I mean, I would now identify as a Rawlsian. I didn't know the term, but the idea that a refugee, for example, isn't an other, but somebody who could be like me, felt very instinctive. And I think that shaped a lot of my political values, because could I imagine me being a refugee? I mean, I had the great fortune to grow up in Cambridge, but Mum was one. It's not hard for me to get the sense that happens to people. But my grandparents, Ben and Lotka, were in many ways amazing. Lotka, I didn't see them at their peak, but Grandma was an artist and a provocateur and brilliant Scrabble player. Benno set up an amazing plastics factory. Back in the day, I don't know what he'd have thought now, but was a really caring, principled person. So I got a huge amount from them, as well as the wider family, and of course my parents.
You said you didn't know your father's parents, but what background were they?
So they were from Austria. So they'd managed to get out.
Are they Jewish?
They were Jewish as well, yeah. So Viennese. We've tried to trace back, and we think actually just over the Czech border. But they managed to get out in the mid-30s to Australia. There were visas available for people in the tailoring business, so they went out on that. And, well, hindsight, were very lucky to get out of Vienna in 33, I think it was. So Dad was born in Australia. And they had a sort of schmatter business. They were, the tailoring business, making clothes. The factory is still there in Sydney. It got sold a long time ago, but they managed to make that new life and so avoided all the horrors of the late 30s and early 40s in Austria.
Okay, so coming down to your parents, you said your dad was a huge influence, and your mother was Felicia. Is that right?
Yeah. So both of them were an immensely huge influence, Huppert and Felicia. I was very lucky to have such great parents in many ways.
Tell me about them and why.
So they're both academics, and I think that's one of the starting points, is that both of them are very, very successful academics doing really interesting things. So Dad's work, as I'm sure you know, is in sort of applied mathematics, theoretical geophysics, which is fascinating. And one of the things, and Mum is a very successful psychologist, so she was working on clinical psychology, then moved towards memory and then aging, and more recently to well-being. So I think she got a bit fed up with working on why things went wrong and started thinking, like, why do things work? So they've both been brilliant. I think one thing that I picked up from both of them in slightly different ways is the power of simplicity and appropriate approximation. So Dad's work was on very, very complex fluid flows, so earthquakes, landslides, a whole range of things like that. And you can write these mathematically as incredibly complicated integrated differential equations. And I remember him saying ages ago that there was a school of thought which said, here's the answer. I said, but this is an equation we can't understand, we can't solve it. In what sense is that an answer? It looks to me more like a problem than an answer. And so a lot of his work was finding ways to approximate the answer, particularly because computational techniques back in the day when he was, PhD student postdocs, meant that you couldn't just numerically simulate things, which we can now for some problems. So we can't really solve it, we can simulate it pretty well. And so you could approximate some things and therefore get an answer that was close to right. So part of the question is, when is close to right not just good enough, but actually much better than saying exactly right, but it'll take us 20 years to get an answer? And when is it useless? When does it not tell you anything? When is it really actually what you most need? And so that's, in some ways, a thread of his work. So he taught me an immense amount about that, but also concepts like dimensional analysis, the amazing power of simplicity to address incredibly complex problems. Just phenomenal things like that. And some of his work, some of his papers are on very prosaic, obvious questions. If you have honey on a flat slide, how does it spread? Sounds easy to state. It's not sort of, some scientific problems you have to spend a long time explaining what the problem means. With his, very often the problem was easy and the answers were rich and inspiring. So I learned a huge amount from that take on how to think about what is a problem, what's a solution. Mum's work, of course, is about humans and how humans behave. And again, you have to approximate, because if you say, look, I'll only really understand this when I've accounted for every single aspect of human behaviour, of course you're not there. So because she was more in the sort of, in some domains, so Dad was sort of much more in the sort of mathematical sciences, whereas Mum had to spend more time dealing with the distinction between what sounds good and what's actually there evidence for. So particularly she moved towards things like well-being. There is some real science of well-being, and she literally wrote a book called The Science of Well-being, and there's some trendy stuff which has no science behind it whatsoever and just sounds quite nice. And so there's a big difference between those, and she was interested in saying, look, what's real, what actually works, and what, sounds like it'd be great, it's just there's no evidence for it whatsoever. And Mum can be quite engaged in that line, and has shown that things which, frankly, I thought were more likely to be nice stories, some of them there's real evidence for, some there isn't. So I learned an immense amount from both of them about how to think constructively. leave aside so many other things, activities, travel, experience, all the things you get from growing up. But in some ways, those were the key thoughts. And they were both, in different ways, they're different people, great parents. I look back on some things and think, it's slightly bizarre they managed to persuade me that things were good. If I was on time for school every day, when I was younger, Dad would set me a maths problem on the Saturday morning. And somehow I was persuaded that was a positive, that was a thing. I'm still incredibly grateful to Dad on a practical level because, again, when I was little, we used to travel quite a bit, mostly to Australia, but also the US and other places. And for a month before a flight, he would say to me, "What do you do on a plane, Julian?" And little me would say, "Sleep," because I think I'd learned that was the right answer, and we would practice that. And to this day, when I get to an airport, I start falling asleep. And so a long haul flight to Australia, I will sleep maybe 12 hours of the 24, and I get more sleep than I normally would. Great skill set. With Mum, there's again loads of things there. She was a great mother, but she's a phenomenal woman in many ways, and particularly because she's been registered blind essentially since her teens. So she has a thing called Stargardt's disease, where there's no central retina. So if she looks at you, as I'm doing now, she couldn't actually see your face. She would have to look away a bit like this in order to actually see a face, and with peripheral vision. And so it's quite phenomenal that she managed to have a successful academic career, a career which involves a lot of reading that she can't do without assistance, and just managed to do all of that and have all of those. But it meant that when I was little, rather than her reading me bedtime stories, she would either make them up, which was an amazing experience, or I would read her bedtime stories, because once I could read, it made much more sense for me to do that bit of it. So again, I learned a huge amount from those experiences. And I'm very proud of her. She ended up taking a very important test case against the university at one stage, peripherally the university, more the central grants body, where they decided that if you're over 35, you were too old to have a new position. Astonishing case, but we may come back to that, we may not, but amazing case.
Right, so I always ask people what their first memory was. Specific memory, not just sort of vague.
So, possibly my first memory, and I'm not, it's possible that there are others, but certainly one very early on was Passover when I was 4. So I was 4 and a little bit, and traditionally at Passover, you have 4 cups of wine. And being 4, I had a sort of little mini goblet, about a tiny little bit. And somehow, and I don't remember this, I must have swapped it cleverly for a full-sized one. And my first memory was actually the next day, and the garden's spinning horribly. And that was my first and only ever hangover. And I don't know whether, I haven't had any since, because I got practice when I was really little, but I certainly remember that. There's a few things I really do remember from 5. I think other very early memories are more that I remember photos of things. I remember remembering, a very old friend of mine, Jean Parker. I remember remembering the sensation of playing in the Botanic Gardens with her, but I don't remember any of it at all.
So I was going to do it later, but since you mentioned Passover, and since you mentioned your parents were Jewish, it says in your Wikipedia you're an atheist.
Yep.
But it'd be interesting to know the path that took you from 4-year-old Passover to atheism.
I'm not sure I was ever not an atheist. I think, unlike Christianity, where the concept of Christian atheism doesn't really make a lot of sense, and there are people who would argue that it could do, Judaism has a very different relationship. So I used to go to Sunday schools and to synagogue occasionally for High Holy Days here in Cambridge, and had a very, very good rabbi, Brian Fox, out in Australia, where I did my bar mitzvah. But to give you an idea, Brian was very much an agnostic. And he saw no problem whatsoever with being an agnostic and a rabbi. It just wasn't a contradiction. Again, in Christianity, there are statements of belief. No such thing as is required or expected in the rabbinate, certainly not in Reform Judaism, which my family were. The cantor, Michael Deutsch, who led the singing and trained me for the bar mitzvah, and had also done my father's bar mitzvah, obviously many, many years earlier, very big, powerful Hungarian character. He was an atheist. And again, there was no problem whatsoever with, we can sing the songs, we can do the cultural things, we can speak Hebrew, we can do the chanting. God, no, it's a myth. So I think I was always an atheist. Mum certainly became an atheist in her early mid-teens. I think Dad is probably more on the agnostic end. I'm not quite certain where he would identify, but it's not a primary aspect of Judaism. So I'm Jewish, and the history of Jewish thought I find quite interesting. I find some theological thought, some I find rather pointless, some I find really fascinating. And I think there are some interesting traditions that I quite like. I don't keep anything Jewish particularly, other than it's a good excuse for a party sometimes. And I do keep one aspect of Yom Kippur almost every year. So Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and traditionally there's a 25-hour fast, and you go to synagogue. I don't do those bits. I'm not interested in the religious bits. But the idea of setting aside 25 hours once a year to just detach and think, whenever possible, and it's, I don't know, probably 2 years out of 3, I will keep that day, almost always on the actual day, but sometimes I'll pick a different day that seems more convenient. And just, take a day where I don't work, I don't do emails, I don't do any of those things. I just try and think about who I am, what I'm doing. I find huge value in that. So I'm slightly Jewish, but historically and culturally rather than actively. Very definitely atheist, and also very much involved with the humanists. Being an atheist as a definition always feels a bit peripheral. Like, most people are atheists about the vast majority of gods, and we don't focus on the fact that very few people believe in Thor. Very few people identify as a Thor isn't a real person. Whereas being a humanist, I'm a patron of the British Humanists, Humanists UK, and I think they do really phenomenal work. But it's much more a positive about how do we support freedom, how do we support thinking, how do we support caring, how do we support all of the good humanist things, rather than focusing on, don't do that one.
Fascinating. Moving on to your own education, you were born in America, but you almost immediately went to UK or Australia?
UK. So I came here when I was about 3 months old. So I'm a sort of accidental American in that sense. I essentially grew up here in Cambridge, with a number of trips in Australia, but nowhere else for long times.
Pick out, since I want to get on to your later life in politics and so on, and therefore we'll skim through your education. But if you could pick out one or two important moments in your education, and maybe one or two teachers who influenced you.
So I think that I was very lucky to go to a range of great schools here, from Milton Road, which is my local state school, King's Choir School here. Dad was a fellow here at King's and was very excited for me to go to that school. The Perse, I wanted to go to Hills Road, but was away for a year in Australia, so they couldn't take me. And I was lucky. So here in the UK, I was very lucky that King's School at the time, I think less so now, was an incredibly liberal school. It was a deeply egalitarian school, non-hierarchical. We knew the teachers by first name or nickname terms. And there's a sense that you were in charge of your own education. Their role was to help guide you in that, rather than tell you what to do. And in particular, there was an amazing guy, Rob Farrow. And Rob was just a transformationally brilliant teacher for me.
What was his name?
Rob Farrow.
Farrow.
Not everybody liked him. He had a particular style. He was manic depressive, and sadly died quite young. Had a number of issues with the school, but he transformed the way I think. I mean, he was an English teacher, and I think English wasn't my strong subject, but he made it interesting. And I remember watching Spitting Image. This was the age of 11, 12, watching Spitting Image cartoons and thinking about how they worked to try to write our own. I also remember, I was not athletic at all, but he persuaded me to come to the athletics club with Tom Womack, and spent ages helping me to do, I think it was an 85 centimetre high jump, which is awful. But he put the time and effort in and actually made me realise that I can't do things, but if I try, I can do them better. And I don't have to win to do it. And turned out I could do triple jump. And he really opened things up in thought, in reading. I stayed in touch with him for many years until he died, effectively. He was sacked by the school. And I remember challenging Pat Bates and then Provost here about why that was. And I think he was very hard done, but I did have a number of mental health problems. He opened my eyes to lots of culture. He used to take people to see plays here or in London. He'd take school trips of sort of 10 to 13-year-olds. And what I didn't know until a number of years later was that he would almost always then miss the last train back to Ely where he lived. And so would just sleep in the corridor in the school. But he thought it was worth it in order to get... So, amazing guy. I was also very lucky to have a few periods of education in Australia. And partly I was very lucky there. I went to the Emmanuel School, which was a very relaxed Jewish school when I was 12, 13.
In Sydney? Or?
In Sydney, yes, always in Sydney, eastern suburbs. And Tess was a newish school and very flexible, so I took different subjects at different age ranges, and so that was great. And then I went to Sydney Grammar School when I was 17, and it was a useful opportunity to be able to redefine myself. So I was a scientist, a mathematician, I did a few other bits and pieces. When I was in Cambridge, when I went to Australia, I became one of the editors of the school poetry magazine because people didn't know I didn't know anything about poetry. And because they didn't know I was rubbish at it, I could actually, I'm not saying it was brilliant, I wrote a couple of things, but being able to redefine myself and choose who I wanted to be was really, really helpful. And I got a lot out of the time in Australia and got involved in Chemistry Olympiad and various other things. So. And there's been a whole range of amazing teachers, Charles Proud and various others. But I was very lucky to have an education that was interested in what I think are the true purposes of education, which are about empowering people to think about things and to take control and to be able to do things, not about simply learning how to pass an exam or to memorise a list of things.
When did you discover you were good at mathematics?
I don't know that I ever discovered it. I just was, and I'm sure it was partly because it was around more. We had a rule: no mathematics at the dinner table, but there was certainly conversation about it. And I think I always was quite good at it. I don't remember noticing that I'd become that.
Or when, perhaps I should phrase it, when did you realise that you were moving towards the sciences rather than the arts at school?
It sounds like I'm taking the question, but I don't think I ever made that decision. I enjoyed them. I hadn't, because I later became a chemist, and I remember at one stage looking back at old school reports and discovering, to my surprise, actually chemistry was the subject I'd had the best reports on. But I was always interested in lots of different things. When I went to Australia, one of the great things there for when I was 17 was being able to do a wider range of subjects. And I was, did economics and I did music and as well as English. And I really liked having that flexibility. But I think I just got science more. And I think I was it about teachers? Not so much. Michael Bishop in Australia was phenomenal as a chemistry teacher, again, also sadly died young. But it was about the subject where you could play and think. There's an argument having in another context right at the moment about whether we should focus on STEM or on creative subjects. And it really annoys me because STEM is creative. And if it isn't, you're doing it wrong. So I don't think I consciously said, I want to be a scientist. When I was sixth form, I would have much rather done a broader set of subjects. And I did do economics A level. I'd love to have done more. My plan was to be a lawyer. That was, I had, I think, every intention of switching to law. Didn't happen, but.
You mentioned music. Has music been important in your life?
Yeah, very much so. When I was younger, I played things, I think mostly because my parents wanted me to, so I did a bit of piano, I did violin, and I didn't get on very well with it. I'm much better at bass than at treble. and I'm actually much better at rhythm than at melody and harmony. So, but there was a moment with violin where I really didn't want to keep playing it, but I thought Mum really wanted me to, so I kept going for her. She was fed up. She didn't enjoy me playing the violin and would much rather I stopped, but thought I wanted to, and so we kept going because she was doing that for me. And there was this moment where we were like, hang on, if you don't want to and I don't want to, let's not do it. I tried playing the French horn for a bit, but my real love was percussion. I had an amazing percussion tutor, Will Sivier. And so for many, many years, I would hit things. And so I did that in all sorts of places, some amazing concerts. I got to play in the Sydney Opera House. I vividly remember at King's Ely doing a really phenomenal piece called African Sanctus by David Fanshawe. He was there for that performance, and I remember just the freedom. It's an astonishing piece of music, a Catholic mass set to African tribal music with recordings he made in the 60s, 70s, going around Africa. Utterly phenomenal, spellbinding piece. And that really helped me. I played a bit of djembe, and got to play in a lot of things when I was an undergrad at Cambridge. So I did this sort of for many years, and a bit as a grad student as well. But there was a real shortage of percussionists at the time, and so you got to play in everything. There was so much demand, and in hindsight, I probably should have done more practice. But you could do a musical this week and this concert that week and that thing that week. I got involved with there was a thing with Fused where we did a series of new compositions with contemporary dance, and that was fantastic. I remember there was one South African choreographer, and I can't remember who the composer was now, but it was all 5 against 4. So I learned to do 4 in one hand, 5 in the other hand, and I realised that if I went just a little bit faster than I was supposed to, I could make all of the dancers fall over. But it was just fun to have that as an outlet. And we did some Cornelis Cardew, sort of slightly very strange, surrealist things at Kettle's Yard. That was really lovely. My girlfriend, my now partner, who might come back to, is a very good musician as well as a scientist. I'm sure that was also part of the strength between us. And I don't play at all now, but I listen a lot and have quite diverse musical tastes. I mean,
I can see. You mentioned coming to Cambridge, and perhaps that's the next stage. Why did you? Well, your father was at Cambridge, so that's an obvious reason for coming. But tell me why.
But both my parents were professors here. In some ways, it's odd. I probably should have gone somewhere else. But when I was applying, I'd just come back from a year in Australia, and so Cambridge didn't feel quite like home again yet. Yeah. I'd had an absolutely brilliant transformational year in Australia. I came back here. No. This was I did my lower 6th year effectively in Australia. Yeah. And so applied when I was upper 6th back here, but I'd been back a couple of weeks, so it felt like I wasn't used to Cambridge yet. Yeah. My plan was to do a year or two of Natski and then switch to law. And Cambridge gave the most flexibility of the top places, and I'm not sure it was the best decision in some ways. I mean, it worked out extremely well, but I might have learnt more by going somewhere else. But so I applied various places, but got into Cambridge, had friends here, and it worked out very well for me. And I slightly regret not having explored a different place.
Which college did you go to?
So I went to Trinity. My decision ultimately was between Trinity and Clare, were the top two I wanted to go to, and it's funny because I obviously knew that the college was much better than the typical applicant. And my reasons for going to Trinity were quite, worked out very well. It was a good place for me, but they were completely wrong. So one of the things was I wanted to be able to do music, and Trinity had more orchestras. And I thought there was a decent chance that I might be able to get into one of them. As it happened, I think Trinity Orchestra was one of the few I never actually played with. I was too busy playing in the rest of the university. And I played at Clare, I played at Robinson, I played all sorts of other places, Queen's, but I think never actually at Trinity, which is slightly bizarre in hindsight. Both lovely colleges, and I ended up spending time at both of them as it happens. But so Trinity Natski came up in '96.
Was there anyone at Trinity who particularly was an outstanding influence on you?
Yes, I mean the I was very, very fortunate, in particular with my director of studies, Shankar Balasubramanian. He's a phenomenal character. I was very lucky, I think, not just to get to know him, but to get to know him when I did. So I first met him when he interviewed me, December 95. He was newish at Trinity then. So I was very, very lucky because he had time. So he's now become a sort of demigod in science. So he was my PhD supervisor, mentor, friend, colleague, all the rest of it. But he's now Sir Shankar. He set up a transformational.
Was he president of the Royal Society or?
President? No, I mean, a fellow of the Royal Society. He's won all the prizes short of the Nobel Prize, and it's always a bit of a lottery. But if he won one, I would not be at all shocked. The work he did there was essentially a new way to sequence DNA, and so the transformational reduction in cost of sequencing DNA is basically because of the work that he did with David Kleinerman. And I had the great, I did a summer's project with him and had a choice between a really interesting piece of thermodynamics about DNA mismatches and frayed ends, or this crazy idea he had to sequence DNA, and I chose the really interesting scientific one. I could have been one of the people there, but Shankar was brilliant, and I learned so much from him scientifically. And so to have him as a director of studies, as an undergrad, as a PhD supervisor, and then all the rest was just, I was phenomenally lucky. He's a great person.
And you kept well in touch with him.
Yes, I don't see him as much as I'd like to because he's very busy. But yes, I mean we're friends and periodically meet up for a drink. And of course I know his group and we still interact. But yeah, no, really, I was very fortunate to know him.
And what was your PhD on? That was at Trinity too.
Yes, that was Trinity as well. So. So I did my undergrad. I never switched to law, although I'd meant
Why
to.
not?
Because I found the science too interesting. I was lucky in so many ways, actually. I had my first ever supervisor was Sarah Teichmann, who's gone on to be absolutely phenomenal. But it was her. I was also her first supervisee as an undergrad. So, and so many other people. I just found science so exciting. In my second year, and Trinity was very supportive. I was also able to take more subjects. So they very kindly funded myself and Marta Zlatic, who's also a brilliant scientist. We did 4 subjects in second year. We were supposed to do 3, and they funded all the supervisions. And so we got to experimental psychology just for fun, with Simon Baron-Cohen supervising us. It was brilliant. And John Gurdon taught me how to dissect frog embryos, and he's quite good at that. And Steve Lay was great as organic chemist, and lots of people. But so I just got too excited by the science. I was doing other things when I come to Model United Nations, which is quite an important influence on my life. But I just stuck with the science, really enjoyed that. I did take a year off before I did the PhD. And actually my hope was to work for UNHCR, was what I really wanted to do. I hadn't quite realised how hard internships were to get. I thought, bright young thing saying, I will do anything you like anywhere in the world for free for a year, just give me somewhere to sleep and some food, would be an attractive offer. But I was naive. Had a very interesting year, did a little bit with the OECD, but mostly working in London for a financial software company. But came back to the PhD with Shankar. Originally, I was trying to work on a really interesting fundamental question about how DNA is replicated. In some ways, it's amazing that when we copy DNA, which happens all the time, the error rate is about 1 in a billion. And that's really interesting. If the error rate was too low, evolution would struggle. We wouldn't be able to adapt. If it's too high, we also wouldn't be able to keep going because we just have too many problematic mutations. Most mutations, statistically, will be bad. So you don't want too many of them. Viruses have another story. So 1 in a billion is quite phenomenal. And to a chemist, it's particularly surprising because there are 4 bases, A, C, G, and T, and they pair up, A with T, G with C. And they're most stable that way. But not 1 in a billion. There should be roughly 1 in 1,000 errors. Because although it's supposed to be A with T, G will go with T reasonably well. Not as well, but reasonably. So it should be about 1 in 1,000. So why is it 1 in a billion. And the biochemistry is really fascinating. So there's about 1 in 1,000 for finding the right base to bring in. Then the chemistry of actually attaching it works better when it fits better. That gives you roughly another factor of 1,000, so you have to get it right twice. But that's still only 1 in a million. And it turns out there's also a delete button. And the deletion happens if it gets it wrong, and essentially gives you another 1 in 1,000 factor. I'm simplifying slightly. And the enzyme that does this is the Clenau fragment of DNA polymerase 1, or equivalent. And sorry, I have to use my left hand because it's shaped like a left hand. And so it has, the enzyme looks a bit like this. The DNA sits in here. And so you've got the template and the bit that's growing. New base binds in here. And the chemistry happens with that finger around here. So that's the important bit. I'm just going to get rid of one finger because it's a bit harder to see. Down here is the delete button. And so sometimes the sequence goes down there and is cut out. And so the question is, how does it do that? Is it that it's here almost all the time unless there's an error, and when there's an error it goes down for deletion? Does it flicker between the two the whole time? How does it actually manage to work? And so my plan for the PhD was to use single molecule fluorescent technology with David Kleinerman as well as Shankar to use a technique called FRET, fluorescence resonance emission, where you can measure on a single protein and a single piece of DNA how far apart things are and how they're moving. You can actually watch that happen. I mean, it was really exciting. People had done these experiments at bulk, but not yet at single molecule. Really interesting fundamental thing, and built onto work Shankar had done before. So I spent 2 years working on that, playing with phosphorus 32 labeling of DNA to check the chemistry all worked, growing up the bugs to produce the protein, labeling with these amazing, incredibly bright dyes, because they have to be bright enough that you can see literally one dot. And 2 years in, it didn't work. Nothing worked. I could make things, but they wouldn't. It was just. I think I'm not a great lab chemist. I'm not fastidious enough for some things. I was juggling with some politics on the side, which I might come back to. But 2 years in, I had basically nothing to show for it. And I remember saying to Shankar, look, either it's going too fast to measure, because if it's really, really fast, you can't see anything, or it's too slow, in which case you can't see it, or there's some other problem where I just can't do it. Like, I don't know, I think he was pretty fed up with me. And I don't think anybody's actually managed to do this yet, so it's possible it wasn't entirely me. The one group I knew would try and gave up a few years later. But I almost dropped out of the PhD and had the conversation with Shankar about saying, look, could I write this up for a master's? Because but I'd done a tiny little piece of work right at the beginning, just to sort of warm up about 4-stranded DNA, and I did a couple of quick experiments, and started thinking a bit about that, and whether you could start thinking more generally about those being more, because they're beautiful structures. And I turned that into a PhD. So basically 1 year was the entire PhD. So and I was very lucky. I had a friend who helped me with some of the coding. I later learned how to code, but Cy Rogers wrote the initial version of the code to do the things that I needed to do, and taught me how to then take over. But it's a really fascinating thing, because everybody knows the double-stranded structure of DNA. Hugely important. It's one of the things that's really made it into public consciousness. But in some ways, and I'm overstating this slightly, it's the boring version. And it's a bit like if you think about books. Most of the time, what shape is a book? It's a oblong that sits stacked with lots and lots of other books on a shelf. And that's an important storage state for a book, but it's not the interesting time. Books are interesting if you open them up. And similarly, DNA is more interesting when it opens up. And it can do so many things other than the double strand. And so my research really pivoted because of that into thinking about what are the other structures. And I started with these beautiful G quadruplexes. So 4 bases in DNA, A, C.
We'll better keep the technical stuff.
Yeah. So, but there are 4 letters which make up DNA: A, C, G, and T. But they're not just arbitrary letters. They are chemicals that can do real things. And so if you take a solution of A, it's a clear liquid. C, clear liquid. T, clear liquid. G forms a gel. G is different from the others. And in particular, when you have a sequence with lots of G's in, they can fold up into sort of knot-like structures that act a bit like on-off switches. And I started to say, well, can we predict, based on the sequence, the letters that you have, when it will do this and when it won't? And I did some fairly basic experiments to explore the parameter space. So does it matter how many G's you have? Does it matter what the gap between them is? How does that all work? Worked with a group in London, Pascal Hazel in particular, who did some computer simulations and came up with something which I call the G quadruplex folding rule. Basically, if it looks like this, it might fold. And once you've got a formula like that, a rule, you can then start asking questions like, where are they in the human genome? Are they where we expect them to be? Statistically, how many ought there to be? What's odd about them? And that was really my PhD. And so the paper where I proposed that rule has been cited well over 1,000 times. I don't know how many since. Still heavily cited. I'm not sure if most people who cite it now have read it or understand it. But and it was intended, and this is what I got from both my parents, as a grotesque approximation. Like, it's not right. We certainly didn't have the evidence to say it's a binding rule. And there was a paper later from brilliant scientist Jean-Louis Merny where he said that the classic Huppert rule is, I can't remember what the figure is, only 84% accurate. I thought if it had been 50-50, I'd have been delighted, But it still meant that you could start to say, where are they? You say, and it turns out, for example, that 2/3 of all cancer-related genes have these control switches in their control areas. Okay, well, suddenly that's interesting. You can work out where they aren't, and there's clearly been evolutionary pressure on them. And so even if not every one that I predict is quite right, and even if it misses a few, you still go, suddenly we've got all of these targets, all of these things to explore. And so what had been a almost failed PhD suddenly turned into actually, I think, quite a successful PhD, which then got me a fellowship at Trinity, one of the junior research fellowships, and I postdoced at the Sanger Institute and chemistry, and then got a position at the Cavendish working on physics of medicine, basically on the basis of approximating something just the right amount.
Fascinating. I understood about half of it.
Sorry.
Approximately. Going back to, you mentioned the other strand in your life, which I want to talk about now, which is your political interests. You mentioned at Oxford, at Cambridge, you were interested in the United Nations. Is that when you first became interested in politics, or even at school?
No, so both of these started at school. So I mean, Modern Nations is perhaps the simpler one, because my interest initially was in international human rights, refugee issues, mum's heritage. And when I went to the Perth, which was a very good school, I was actually quite bored because I'd had a great experience in Australia beforehand, and King's was at the time phenomenal. And I just wasn't feeling stretched at all. I remember, we'd done phenomenal, we were reading French magazines, we just used French as a language. And I remember an early lesson at the Perth where we were practicing counting to 100. It's like, well, I can just do this. Like I can go to 1,000. Like, this is not, there's nothing to learn from this. And after a bit, I was bolshy enough to say to the head, Martin Stevens, that I was quite bored. And he gave me some of the worst advice I've ever been given, actually, which was learn to be bored. And I think I know what he was trying to say, but we've chatted since, but when I was more of an adult. But I was very lucky that a friend of my parents mentioned a program called Model United Nations, which is simulations of the UN. I got very involved with that at school, set up at one at my school. Then when I came here, got involved with that, set up the Model United Nations Society here. We then took that group. We actually won the World Model United Nations Conference, Harvard World, in Brussels. And then the next year hosted the World Conference here in Cambridge. did a lot there, and I'm still senior treasurer. And that was quite helpful to me in thinking about the world. But also, unlike debating, lots of politicians come up through debating.
Yeah.
In a debate, I win by proving you wrong.
Yeah.
You win by proving me wrong.
Yeah.
In a UN-style discussion, you win by persuading everybody that you've reached something everybody can live with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamentally different success. So if it's a Security Council simulation or General Assembly, success is working out how to compromise and bring everybody's interests together.
Mm.
Not by proving somebody to be. You don't need a loser for you to win. That was very important. But my values were very much. I grew up under Thatcher, and I always knew I was on the other side. I don't remember the 83 election. I vaguely remember the 87 election, feeling disappointment. I definitely remember 92. I think we were in Australia when it happened, and just the shock that it hadn't been the end of the Tories. But it was actually when I was at the Purse as a sixth former that I realised I used to row twice a week, and because of the timings, it meant that when I was having lunch, I would watch whatever was on television, and Prime Minister's Question Time always happened to be on that slot, because it used to be Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so I watched that, and the discussions afterwards was when I realised I was a liberal, with a capital L as well as a small l. And that was thanks to the likes of Paddy Ashdown. And, I don't remember exactly who I saw, but I realised I was liberal, not just left. I hadn't really done much about that. And then when I was 17, so upper sixth back here, in the run-up to the local elections, a leaflet was delivered through my door. I now know by Ian Nimmo-Smith, who then went on to be leader of the council and mayor, for the Lib Dems. And I thought, actually, I do agree with this. And so I decided to join the Lib Dems. I went over to the place I was told to go to, which was the house of a guy called David Howarth, who then became leader of the council and MP. David, being David, couldn't find a membership form anywhere in his house, but somebody else came over by chance then, who did, Sal Brinton, who was leader of the Lib Dems on the county council and became a baroness and president of the Lib Dems. So I was quite lucky with that set of people. So I joined the Lib Dems. I couldn't vote in those elections, but then when I came up to Cambridge, I got involved with the Lib Dem Society here, and really enjoyed the campaigning, the philosophy, the ideas, the vision for liberalism. I didn't go into it to hold office. That was never the plan. In fact, it was an argument with Mike Proctor, former provost here at King's, who was at the time Dean of Trinity. And in the 97 election, which was an amazing moment to be involved in, he had a rule that nobody was allowed political signs in their windows, and the porters went around and took them all down. And a few of us were annoyed. I didn't have a great spot. A friend of mine who had a great spot for Labour on the other side was really annoyed. And at a dinner of some kind, I had a go at Mike around the table somewhere, because I thought this was really unfair, being slightly bolshy. He said, no, my ruling is final. No political signs unless you're the candidate. I thought, that's interesting. And at the time, you had to be 21 to stand. But so when I was doing my part 3, I stood for the city council in Abbey, unwinnable seat at the time, mostly so that I could put a big Lib Dem diamond. And when the porters came to take it down, say, no, this one actually does have the Dean's approval because I'm the candidate. And so it was mostly just making that point. I didn't expect to win. And then the next year, I was asked by our agent, Phil Rogers, whether I'd like to stand for a winnable seat in East Chesterton for the county council. In the last minute, I actually already was planning to stand just to help out in Abbey again. And very quickly changed and won the seat from Labour and became a county councillor in 2001, just a couple of months before starting my PhD.
Interesting. So you didn't go up the kind of union path of debating?
No. I was involved a bit with the union. I got elected onto one of the sort of small committees. I hated the hackery. It was, I remember every week, so 2 people who were responsible for posters, and one of them would define their job. They had to produce the posters, and they said their job finished when there was a completed poster on the computer. And the other person was in charge of distribution, and they said their job started when there was a printed pile of posters ready to be distributed. And the thing was that people too often were essentially saying, what's the least I can do to not get in trouble and rise up the ladder? And so every year it was a muppet like me, I was on Treasurer's Committee, who would do the bit in between, because I actually thought it'd be quite a good idea to get people to know about the things we're doing. And so I didn't enjoy that much. I did do a bit of debating. Very fortunately, once managed to meet a couple of friends who'd won the world debating competition, which just shows how much of a random thing it is. But I was much more involved with the MUN, so I knew the union. I've been to things, I've spoken up there many times, but it wasn't the environment I liked. I got, a friend elected as president and former neighbour, but yeah, it wasn't quite my thing.
How did you make the jump from local politics to national politics?
So I did 8 years on the county council, and became leader of the opposition at the time when Cambridgeshire looked like it was going to be Conservative forever.
I mean, this must have taken a lot of your time.
I think Shankar wasn't very impressed with me. Although I still remember, so I happened by sheer luck to be at Trinity when the fellowship and election results were being read out, and it really was just like I had no idea what it was, and was very surprised to hear my name read out. Delighted. And I remember Shankar coming over to me and saying, "Congratulations, this means you can really focus on science." And I remember Martin Rees, who was master at the time, coming over and saying, "Congratulations, means you can really focus on politics." I'm not sure Shanks was pleased about, but at first it was about half a day a week, and it worked quite well. Later, when I was leader of the opposition, it was probably more like 2.5 days a week, and it was quite time-consuming, but I managed to make it work. But then in 2007, we'd had a very successful election campaign in 2005. We'd gained. I was very happy with that. I thought, look, what I want to do, I don't want to be leader of the opposition forever, because it's just a bit frustrating. I remember working really hard on a really good budget amendment for the end of year, and we put a lot of effort into really doing it properly. So actually costing things out, actually thinking what we'd do, what we'd give up in order to do the things we wanted. And it was the best I think we'd done for a long time. And I gave a speech, which I'd spent ages working on, to really push it through, and I'd set up the new systems for scrutiny, I'd done all sorts of things to the best it would possibly be. And huge amounts of time and effort, and the Lib Dems all voted for our amendment, the Tories all voted against it, and Labour abstained. And I thought, if I'd actually done it on the back of an envelope, and we hadn't bothered to really do it properly, what would the vote have been? I thought, exactly the same. And I thought it's actually quite frustrating. I was able to get things done. I chaired the Cambridge Traffic Management Committee, so did a whole lot of things to the transport system here, which mostly worked very well. But I got a bit frustrated. I thought, look, I can't keep doing this and science at a high level. And I had stood for Parliament in 2005 in Huntingdon, but to help out mostly. We needed to find some candidates. And I did go for then a serious selection for Parliament in Oxford East. A guy called Steve Goddard had come very close to winning in 2005. And the story I'd been given was, this is an amazing target seat. He didn't do it last time. Somebody more dynamic might be able to. And I went for the selection. Massively didn't win it. Steve is a very nice guy, and he was a young academic from the sort of liberal green wing of the party with a ginger goatee who cycled around everywhere. And I spent a month in Oxford campaigning, and people sometimes got us confused because we looked quite a lot like each other. And when your only USP is you're the one who's not from Oxford. And so basically people who liked him put him first, me second, and the third candidate, Liz Leffman, who's also brilliant, but a different bit of the party, third. And people who didn't like him put her first, me second, and him third. And so I got basically all the second preferences, and nobody actually wanted me. And so I thought, look, Parliament's not happening. David Howarth, who was by that time the MP here, will hold the seat. I've been very involved with helping run his campaign in 2005. Will hold the seat as long as he wants to. How wrong I was, but I think I should make a decision. And so I decided in 2009 I retired from politics. So that was in May. I stood down from the council and I really said, look, I'm just going to focus on science. I've got an academic job, let's do that. That October, I heard that David was planning to stand down very unexpectedly in just a few months' time at the next election. I thought, that's interesting. You don't often get a chance to represent your home seat. And having not expected David to stand down, I thought, look, if he is, I'm going to give it a go. And so there was a fascinating selection process done quite quickly because the election was coming, ran over December, January, and I had a fantastic team and ended up winning the selection. It was an amazing, I can bore you for ages about the selection process itself, but it was very well run, very nice. We all broadly got on quite well, which was always nice. I remember the returning officer saying it was the first selection he'd been involved in for a big seat where he was contacted more often by candidates saying something's gone wrong in my favour and I think it might be a bit unfair than people complaining. But I won the selection in January and then had a very short run into the general election and became the MP.
And you were MP for 5 years?
5 years.
Tell me about one. We're now getting into sort of the public domain of what people know about, but tell me about one or two high or low points in those 5 years.
It was an amazing experience in many ways, and because I hadn't been somebody who hung out around Westminster beforehand, it was all very, very new to me. A lot of MPs have been in lobbying or PR or working for an MP and know that I didn't. And it was also very strange because it was a coalition. We were in government. It was the first time in peacetime for a century that there'd been Liberals in government. It was a sort of bizarre experience. And I learnt very quickly, but not quickly enough. Some highlights would definitely include bits of legislation I got to be involved in. So I was very involved. So I became the Lib Dem spokesperson on Home Affairs, Justice and Equality. So all the easy subjects, immigration, human rights, same-sex marriage. I got to be very involved in getting the same-sex marriage legislation through, and opening that up quite significantly. I'd been involved when I was at school in campaigning for the 0.7% gross national income to be on international development aid, and I got to co-sponsor the legislation that made that law. Well, Boris broke it, but and so there are immense things like that I got to do, and I campaigned again. Sal Brinton reminded me that I'd been at school. I'd been in a photo about underfunding of Cambridgeshire schools. Managed to get, I can't remember how much money, 35 million extra for Cambridgeshire schools. I got to do a lot of those things. But there are also a lot of pressures, and there are certainly decisions that I agonise about. When is it worth actually achieving something versus shouting about how awful something is? Because if I'm a believer in negotiation, compromise, and getting, making things better, not just always holding out for perfection. But there's downsides to it as well. I did some good things on state surveillance. Killed off the comms data bill, which was still awful. I think we did manage to get things in a much better place there. I was named Internet Hero of the Year for 2013, which is an amazing sort of thing in London. I think Erren won the Internet Villain of the Year that year. So he didn't show up to collect his prize, but I did. And I did some good stuff, I think, on drugs policy, which was again fascinating, and on a lot of local things. We had, I think it was 35,000 pieces of casework in 5 years.
Wow.
And so just seeing bits of people's lives and being able to, in some cases, fix them, and really just provide them with the support that they needed. In other cases, just seeing dissent. But there's certainly times, and I wasn't always, I still occasionally have people who say, "You intervened and did transformed this thing for me." Too often it was about dealing with the immigration, the Home Office, who were just randomly rubbish at times. Housing issues were the other really big one. So the local things were amazing. But it was also the most stressful thing I've ever done. You never stop. and you know, Caroline, my partner, hated me being in politics. She didn't want much to do with it and stayed out of it, which is fine. She saw the worst of me. She saw the exhausted version of me who'd been out emoting and doing, and then. But I remember once, early in the season, we went to climb Snowdon, and it was still snowy, icy. Visibility was a few metres, so it was from crampons and ice sacks. I've been up several times. It's the only time I've done it with crampons and ice sacks in order to get to the top. And there were a few people clustered around the top, you know, ice covered everywhere, you know, all wrapped up warm. And, you know, we politely said hello. It wasn't a normal tourist crowd. And one said, "Oh, are you Julian?" It's like, "Yeah." "Would you be free to speak at our Rotary event?" And I remember thinking, look, does it look like I've got my bloody diary with me? I'm on holiday. I'm at the top of a mountain. I'm not working. So I think that was really hard. And the cultural style of politics became much nastier over those 5 years. And some people really were extraordinarily nasty. I don't mean disagreement. I'm very comfortable with disagreements, but actively nasty. And I think that was a shame. But no, you know, I got to do some amazing things and in a number of ways make differences that I'm quite proud of.
You obviously enjoyed it enough to want to go on because you attempted.
I did.
To win a seat in at least 2 subsequent elections, and if the chance came up now, you would probably take it, would you?
Well, so I stood again in 2015 and very narrowly lost by 599, not I'm counting. And I mean, that was essentially, we as a party were punished for being in the coalition. And one can talk about, I give lots of thoughts about that, but it was a very hard thing. And actually losing is really hard. Regardless of party, you know, it's exhausting. You know, finding out at 5 a.m. after 5 years of huge effort, but a month of absolutely solid effort, that you're not there in a very public way as well. I mean, awful things happen to people all the time, you know, and there are much worse things that happen, but rarely so publicly. Rarely are you told you've lost your job because people don't want you, you know, and everybody knows. You know, you can't just go to the pub and relax. And that was really, really tough. I was very helped by, actually, things like the beer festival was really helpful for me when I was volunteering. It's a nice way to recover. I was quite depressed, I think, for a year or so. And yes, I did try again in 2017, which was again a bizarre election. Swung from being a very anti-Labour election to a very anti-Tory election suddenly. And so at the beginning of the campaign for that snap election, I was having quite a lot of Labour members in Cambridge saying, "I'll be voting Lib Dem because we can't have Corbyn." And then over the weekend with Theresa May's awful manifesto, it changed from "we have to stop Corbyn" to "we have to stop Theresa." And so I went from winning comfortably to losing comfortably, which is, you know, frustrating and hard. But and I haven't stood since, and I'm not planning to stand since. I do other things to keep the public service work going, the political vision and values work. And I'm not saying I would never stand again, but you know, I don't think we will win Cambridge until there's a Labour government. I think once there's a Labour government, I think things will change massively, because I think they will struggle to continue to say all the things that people believe they will do. And, you know, we'll see a transition. But also I'm now being moved into my house is staying the same, but the boundary means I'm now in South Cambridgeshire, where Pippa Halings is very likely to win. I hope she'll win. I'll be delighted to get her to win again. So I'm hoping to have a Lib Dem MP representing me again, at least.
Right. Well, we've got about 12 minutes or so. So there were 3 current political things I was just hoping you might comment on. One was your interest in the UN. I read a book recently called The Great Convergence by Kishore Mahbubani. I don't know if you know it. He was the Singaporean ambassador to the UN for some years. And this is about whether we can save the United Nations given its current structures. And his view is that if it goes on as it is constituted at the moment, it's absolutely hopeless. It can't do anything. And he has some suggestions for improving it. But do you think we can save the UN or replace it with something that is better?
So I think the UN is spectacularly flawed and essential. I think it has less good of a reputation than it should do, partly because a lot of the things that are done, people don't notice the fact that things just work. That we don't notice the fact that I think it was UNESCO who standardised globally traffic light colours. We don't think about that. We don't attribute that to the UN. It's just kind of, it's obviously quite convenient that red means stop everywhere and green means go everywhere. But that didn't just randomly emerge. And so I think the UN existing means the world is a much, much better place. The number of conversations that are happening between countries that would otherwise struggle to talk, just because there is a UN for them to happen. So I think there's a huge amount we don't see. I think it's also hugely flawed. I think there are many structural problems with it. I think the way the Security Council operates is deeply problematic. I think many of the institutions are deeply bureaucratic. I think there's a whole lot of problems as well. I think if we lost it, we would regret that bitterly. The League of Nations was more flawed. We redid it after a world war. I'd rather we found a way not to have a world war while we try to create this. Because ultimately, there are... I'm a great believer, and I think I say always have been, I'm sure there was a time where I wasn't thinking about these things, in government at the appropriate level. And I want people to have as much local decision-making power as possible where sensible. So small things should always be done locally if at all possible. And you scale up, and then some things can only be done globally. And we need to have globally reliable systems for agreeing some things, because otherwise it all falls apart. So I'm a nervously critical, concerned optimist. If we don't have proper ways for the world governments to interact, things become much, much, much worse. And I think while there are flaws with the UN, it always seems to me that anything else would be more problematic and we would regret it. Ultimately, I'd like to see a properly constituted world government in a federal way. I mean, we're centuries away from that possibly. And I'd like to see a better way of managing the UN and running the UN. I think there are lots of flaws in fundamentally believing in nation states as the compulsory building blocks, but we're a long way away from that. It's not going to happen for a long time.
Well, I agree with all that. The second question, a particular part of the world tensions at the moment, is the relations between the United States in particular and the West and China. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm an interested novice, but I've been thinking about it really since. There's an exchange program between the British political parties and the Chinese Communist Party, and in 2010 I went on that to Beijing and Shanghai, and we met some very, very senior people from the party and had a really interesting delegation from the UK as well. And it gave me some really insight, and of course the thinking and reading in advance and reflections afterwards. And I think there are some real challenges. China is a surprisingly nervous country. And certainly the very strong steer I got from that visit in particular was that they said, essentially, the Chinese history is everything goes very well and there's great stability. And then there's a period of instability, everything goes wrong for a while and the kingdom collapses. And then eventually it comes back and we have a period of stability. And that fear of instability was a really driving piece. And so I remember the conversations there. They were surprisingly open They put Tibet on the agenda for us to chat about. They were interested in talking about democracy and how you make it work. But everything was overlain with this, as long as there's no risk of instability. And that was pre-Xi. I mean, things have definitely changed. But there is that fear of things there. So it's different, whereas, the US isn't scared of instability. The US is perhaps overconfident that it has the right to tell other people what to do. China, I think, is in a slightly different place. And I think they were very scared by some of what Trump did. This idea that, we don't have control over our own destiny. If we can't have access to things, that's terrifying. They're terrified of people having control over them. And while they go further than I think is the right balance in trying to have control over their own citizens and over activities in other countries, there's some horrific behaviour, I think it's driven by that fear of others doing that to them, which puts it in a slightly different place. I'm really nervous about the risk of conflict. There's this whole idea of the Thucydides trap, which I'm sure you know, and in some ways is, of course, oversimplified. But I could very much imagine, let's say, a US naval commander saying, if there's going to be a war with China, the sooner the better. And therefore, an incentive to escalate something. Which doesn't need escalation. And China is absolutely being provocative, and some of its actions in South China Sea are provocative as well. But I don't think it wants that war. I mean, my sense was very much that a war would be bad for China because of the risks of instability. So I'm nervous about how that will play out. I think Russia's making things much, much worse, but I see Russia as much more malign in some of those ways. I hope China will get out of the Xi era and learn to be a bit more relaxed and less terrified about critique. I don't know where it will go. I am nervous. I'd love us to get to a stage where we say, look, there are cultural differences, all sorts of differences, and that's wonderful, and we can work together, and everybody can be much more secure. And I think there is a route to that, but it relies both sides to trust that the other one will stick to that.
Thank you. Last one, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but obviously all of us are thinking a lot about the Israeli-Gaza war at the moment, and with your background and your political interests and so on, if there's any insight you want to share with us on that matter.
I'm not sure I have that much insight. I run a centre at Jesus College now, the Intellectual Forum. We had Philippe Sands end of October.
Did you? I read his East-West Street.
Which is brilliant, but he gave a brilliant talk about this. It wasn't on the agenda when we booked it, but so he's much better on this than I am. But I find it terrifying. I went to Gaza in 2010. It was something I said I wanted to do in the run-up to the election, because I was hearing very different stories about what life was like in Gaza. So I'd actually like to go and see for myself what's it like. So I went in, it must have been September 2010, and we met a number of people from different sides in Gaza, and the sense of, we wrote a report, and actually I managed to get a big debate in Parliament when I came back, and the sense of imprisonment, the sense of disempowerment. And one of the things, there are lots of impressions, but Israel, in my mind at the time, was behaving against its own interests. I think Hamas, and there are more extreme groups than Hamas even, are horrific. And there's no defending what they did on the 7th of October, like hideously awful. But I think Israel has fostered a situation which helped Hamas. We saw that very directly in 2010. So this was in the era where there were tunnels from Egypt. And we actually went into one of the tunnels. Like, they were huge. They were really obvious. And Hamas made a lot of money on the imports. They basically charge a tax. And things came in either there or from Israel. And every time a rocket was sent off by Hamas, Israel would tighten the border. And the consequence of tightening the border was that more things came through the tunnels, with the consequence that Hamas made a profit. And so certainly at the time, the situation was that Hamas sending off a rocket got Israel to make more money for Hamas. And Israel is not run by stupid people. Mossad are, not perfect. There's all sorts of criticisms, but they're not idiots. I can't believe they didn't know this. And you never want to incentivize an opponent to do the things you're against. And it was, and so there was this ridiculous situation where Israel's behaviour was leading to worse things. They were, I'm sure not by choice carefully, but they ended up supporting Hamas's income stream, which you don't want. And so I found, and the sense of helplessness, the inability for an economy to flourish, meant that people were, you could see, being forced into combative positions because there wasn't an alternative. There's some interesting comparisons with Northern Ireland, and I spoke a lot to John Alderdice, who's a friend and colleague from Parliament, of course. One of the things that changed in Northern Ireland was that the benefits of peace were stronger and stronger for the people in Northern Ireland from each side. And so if you were a Republican civilian in Northern Ireland, you increasingly start saying, sorry, what is it we're fighting and dying for? Like, I can go, the EU helped, of course, but, if I want to go to Dublin, I can just go to Dublin. If I want to, what is it that's so important that would change my life if we win? It's not that different. It's a bit different, but not exciting enough to fight and die for. And again, if you're a unionist, it's like, well, we are part of the UK. Like, what is it we're fighting and dying for? Like, it doesn't matter that much. And so I'm not trying to trivialise the differences there, but it became less important than the benefits people got from economic growth, development, and you can see the alliance doing better and better because saying this isn't the fight that we care about. Whereas in Gaza, there was no opportunity. People couldn't do the work that they had been doing. It was, we met some people who are doing some nice computer-aided design stuff because they could work electronically, and every now and then the internet would work and they could send the results out. But otherwise, shipments of flowers were only happening occasionally. There wasn't an economy, huge unemployment, lots of people with nothing to do, and no way for that to get better. So there weren't the strong voices saying, could you please stop antagonising? Because we don't have anything else to do. And so the debate that I had was supposed to be a half-hour German debate and ended up being much, much longer because some other business started early. So it was really quite a big debate in the end. And I reread recently my speech, the various bits of it, my summary at the end. And I'm not sure it was the greatest foresight of anybody, but I said what I saw was that there's this, the pressure cooker that's being created there's no way to defuse that. The pressure will just keep building and building until it eventually erupts in furious violence. And I'm not saying I have this brilliant insight that no one else would have had, but unfortunately that's what happened. Is that
now will it go on?
Well, the problem is, at the time I was arguing for various ways to try to rebuild. I still believe in a two-state solution, all of those things, but it becomes harder and harder because I don't see how Israel can destroy Hamas, and I don't see how Israel can destroy the ideology of Hamas. And it's a nasty ideology, I'm not, but which ideologies have ever been stamped out by military assault? And what worries me is you're going to be left with a destroyed Gaza with even fewer people who feel that they have benefits from peace and agreement and settlements. There are groups worse than Hamas. There were in 2010, there are now. It could just become worse and worse and worse. And I think what you have, unfortunately, is an awful ideology in Hamas. And these aren't directly comparable, of course, but Netanyahu is also, I think, somebody I massively oppose on every possible way, desperate to stay in power. He needs this to go on. because he's out. You know, if there's a peaceful settlement, he's out. And I just don't see very good answers. You know, we have to have a way where Palestinians, whether they are in Gaza, West Bank, Israel, feel empowered, feel that they are in a position which is good and can get better. And at the moment, the sort of far right Netanyahu style, I mean, I think they're an abomination in many ways. I'm against far right in all forms, but it's a particularly virulent one. They aren't interested in creating positive environments for the others. And it's just going to keep being worse. You know, you either have constant military incursion, or you kill. They don't have a way to step off that ramp at the moment, and I just think that's hideous. I think future solutions have to involve a two-state thing. They have to involve massive rebuilding. They have to involve Gazans feeling empowered to do things. And, you know, there are some awful people there. Hamas are awful, but it's because of the history of the people there. If you want Gazans to be like everyone else and fundamentally good, you have to give them opportunities. That, you know, it's going to take a long time.
Well, on that cheery note, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening.
Julian, that was fascinating.